webinar on building contamination and more broadly about turning demolition waste into the building materials, which is a very important topic if we're talking about building materials reuse and circular economy. This webinar will be presented by the Remediation Working Group of Inogen Alliance. So firstly, briefly about Inogen Alliance. It's a global alliance of local experts. So Inogen Alliance is about serving our clients globally around the world and ensuring that the quality of the service is equally high everywhere we go. We've got 200 offices globally, more than 6,000 staff, and lots of different projects, more than 150 countries globally. So, and briefly about our presenters. So we've got Rikke Sødegaard from Denmark, representing DGE. Then Chris Wood from Lucian Group, UK, and Theo Kevins from Antea Group, Belgium. And my name is Heikki Kalle, and I'm from DGE as well. I'm going to moderate the webinar today, and I'm from Estonia. So what we're going to do today is, after the introduction, we're going to the 3 presentations, 3 case studies. First is going to be from Denmark, talking about legal requirements in Denmark on building materials reuse and safety, especially how to ensure safety and of building materials and how to manage cleanup before demolition so the materials can be reused. And the second presentation will be from UK on building materials, focusing mostly on asbestos. And third presentation will be from Belgium on waste traceability and recycling maximization. And we are trying to keep presentations 15 minutes each, so that we've got plenty of time for the questions and answers. And in case there are lots of questions, we certainly hope there are, then our presenters have promised that we can answer them also in written form if there are too many of them, and send you them in written after the webinar. So with that, I'm going to conclude my brief introduction, and I'm welcoming first presentation. Rikke, are you ready? I'm going to share your presentation now.
My name is Rikke, and I'm working for DGE in Denmark, where I'm working with the hazardous materials in buildings and recycling of the materials. I have been working in this area for the last 10 years. It's been an area where I have experienced that the demands have changed very quickly, and I'm thinking that it will change in the future as well, where we'll see further bigger demands that we are used to for today. And I'll say it in this way, that here in Denmark, we are used to having a lot of demands in this area. Today, I'll be talking about a short agenda with these 4 subjects, with the hazardous materials in buildings and the Danish legal requirements, and then moving on to the circular constructions, where recycling and reuse of the materials is in the focus. And then a little about reusing or recycling old materials as old bricks, and ending off with a couple of examples where we recycle some, for example, old bricks in a good way. Here in Denmark, my personal opinion, and I can hear from some colleagues in other countries, that Denmark is pretty good up in front in the investigation of hazardous materials. For the normal projects, we are checking for PCB, 8 heavy metals, and asbestos, and PAH, and hydrocarbons, and other stuff. And we check for that in every project we have. And then on the way, we see that PFAS is a subject that's moving around in all the other areas that we are working with. We know it's there in the water along the Danish coastlines, and we know it's in the ground. but we also know that it's in our building materials. So it's just a matter of time before we also start checking for that. And my personal opinion is that we're just waiting for the Danish authorities to set some limit values for PFAS so we can start checking it and put it into our reports. Here in just 2023, we have experienced that there has become a really big focus on asbestos in our projects, because some people find asbestos in hidden materials, but also some people handle it quite wrong. And when you handle it wrong, you will see that asbestos is being spread all around in the buildings and in the areas. And it's a bad thing with asbestos, because in the end, if you don't handle it wrong, you can die from breathing in it. But if you handle it right and you get rid of it in the right way, asbestos isn't as big as a problem as it could be. So if you do the thing right way the first time, then you can easily get around with it. But because we see this big focus on asbestos right now, there's a big focus from the local authorities like the Labor Inspectorate and our clients and owners and people working on the projects and on the sites. But again, if you do it the right way, like the man on the picture is trying to do, then everything is okay. And if you stop the project when you find something that you didn't know was there, then you're on the right path there. Talking about the Danish legal requirements, for right now, there's no really direct legal requirements for the circular constructions, which we are jumping over to now. But in this year, the building regulations has set demands to the carbon dioxide emissions calculations, where the demands set for that will increase the focus for the demands for recycling building materials in the new upcoming and constructions and buildings. And so there's no demands in the legal requirements for reusing the buildings, but because of this, trying to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions, that will increase the demands for recycling materials. So one thing leads to the other thing, and hopefully that will end up to be a good thing here in Denmark. Also, right now we have ongoing research about reusing the concrete, where people are researching, trying to crush down the old concrete and put it into the new concrete and show that it can be as good as the new concrete with raw materials from the gravel pits. And people are making that research because not only that we would like to reuse the concrete, but because it's kind of a big need here in Denmark, because the study shows that the Danish gravel pits will be empty of raw materials within the next 5 to 30 years, and the gravel pit nearest to Denmark's biggest city will be emptied first. So in 5 years' time, they're saying that the gravel pits in the biggest island in Denmark will be emptied of raw materials. And that's a really bad thing. Sorry. So for the need of it, we have to try to be better to reusing the concrete, and that's and for my area, we have to make sure that the material we are reusing have to be clean. So that's why we are checking for example, PCB and heavy metals and asbestos. Also, there's no legal authorities for the local areas that have been set to make sure that the requirements for example, circular demolitions and constructions, there's no legal authorities that's setting demands to that. But we see that the owners of the buildings and the people who are trying to make projects for the owners are setting their own demands in their project materials. So the owner is making the people who are bidding on the projects have to describe what they're doing. For example, the circular demolitions, how they're recycling materials, and the better descriptions they're making for the problems, the bigger score that gets of points. So it's no longer just only the price that means something, but also how they are reusing the materials. Also here in Denmark, and I'm guessing you have that in other countries too, we have the GGNB building systems, and it's a big topic in Denmark now because it's a thing where you have to recycle and reuse a lot of materials, and the more the better. But you also have to make sure that you don't drive so far away with your materials. So for example, in the GGNB buildings, there are set demands that you're not allowed to drive 8 kilometers away if you have any waste. And that gives, in the big cities, that's not a problem. But when you go out to the country, you have to you have to really think about that, because suddenly 50 kilometers isn't such a big distance. Also in the GGNB systems, they're making sure that the buildings are being controlled for example, PCB, heavy metals, and asbestos. And the people checking for that has to be a third party checking for that. So it can't be the building owners themselves or anybody involved in the project. There have to be somebody who don't have an active role in building that, or in making that project. And that's also in those projects they're trying to recycle bricks if it's possible, and as far as possible we would like to reuse things in the projects, and if it's not possible in the correct project there, you could reuse it in some other projects. And the more you reuse, the higher score of points you get, and you can in the end call your GGNB building for a gold building or diamond building and stuff like that. And that's a good PR show for the building owners, but also good for the energy and health in the buildings. Here in Denmark, we see a little bit of problems with the recycling materials, where architects and engineers would like the documentations on the durability of the materials, which there sometimes are problems in presenting. But for right now, the old bricks, there has been done CE labels on the old bricks, so we can now show the documentation on those, but we can't show it on the other materials yet. But I know there are people working on that, as well as on the cross concrete, as I mentioned before, because we have to get documentation on that so we can reuse that in the new concrete and make sure that it is a good thing to put under our new buildings, so it lasts as long as possible. Here in Denmark, we are really good at reusing old bricks in Denmark, and we have been doing that for many years now. And people know that it's a possibility to get the old bricks and put them into the new buildings. It's also here in Denmark, our new bricks and old bricks often have the same size, so it's not a problem to put it into the new buildings. But before you have to reuse them, you have to make sure that it's clean for the PCB and heavy metals that can be in the paint. And as long as the bricks are clean or are being cleaned, so there's no paint on it, you can reuse it in the next building. We have also recently started on importing old German bricks to Denmark, where we can use it for outdoor material as flooring and walls and other stuff like that. I'm not sure if we're only using it for outdoor materials because of the German size. There's a difference one and from the Danish, or it's because of it's not good for using it for indoor use, but I'm guessing it's only for the size problem because it can be built into the new buildings. Otherwise, then from the bricks, we have also here in Denmark a little island named Bornholm, where they have been recycling the roof tiles for more than 20 years, which is a thing with the Bornholm's architecture. So when you have to take down an old building or the roof, you have to make sure with the local authority that you take down all the small roof tiles, and the good ones you have to put aside so you can put them up on your own roof or some other roof. So they're trying to make sure that all the roof on Bornholm is just as same looking as all the neighbors' houses. And if you look to the picture on the right side, you can see how all the houses are looking the same. So it's in the Danish, I would say, architecture and genes that we would like to reuse for the materials where we can reuse it in an easy way first and then take the harder materials after that. Then we're gonna go for some examples. We have had projects here in Denmark where we had a mission house where it was going for demolitions, and all the bricks from that building was taken down carefully and cleaned off, and then taken down to another building in the local area where they had to build up a new pub. For the Danish humor, and there's not so many Danish here today, but the Danish humor is that it's funny. It's a funny story because in the mission house you don't drink, but in the pub you drink a lot. And if you take the other good story is that it's a good story for the health and the environment, because for every brick you reuse, you save a half kilo of carbon dioxide emissions. And also the other bricks have been CE labeled, so you can document that they are just almost as good as the new bricks you can buy out in the shops. And I'm guessing that the next thing we'll see is that we're trying to recycle all the roof tiles that there's no problem with them, so take them down carefully and put them up on some new houses. But of course, you always have to remember you must be sure there's of hazardous materials in it. And the last example we have is from my local working area in Aarhus, the second biggest city here in Denmark, where we have had a hospital where we had to take down all the old bricks, and it was transported to another local area where they had to build a new school, and around 400 bricks were recycled from the old hospital into the new school and saved over 200 tons of carbon dioxide. It's a good story to tell the small students in the school, but also a good thing, again, for showing that you can recycle materials and put it into new things and make sure that you don't have to drive so far as long as you just get it into the projects in an early phase. That was the quick tour from here, and you're welcome to put them in the end.
Thank you very much, Rika, for a very good presentation. Hold your breath for the questions, and the questions will be at the end. So, but now we are moving to the next presentation. Chris, which comes from UK. Chris, are you ready?
Okay, yes, as long as you can hear me, I shall start sharing my presentation.
It worked fluently this time. So
there we go. You can see me. Fantastic. So hello, everybody. My name's Chris Wood. I work for Leasing Services. We're just going to briefly be talking about the circular economy in UK construction. So recycling of building materials, demolition waste is mainly what we're talking about. So making sure that those buildings are clean. So that's what we're referring to when I'm referring to building hygiene. So making sure construction materials are clean so that we can ultimately reuse them. So very briefly, just in terms of who we are, so Leasing Group is a group of companies. Leasing Services, who I work for, we're a hazardous material testing inspection company and general consultancy. Within our group, we also have Radiation Protection Services, who does what it says on tin, deal with radiation, landform surveys, Midland surveys, ground topographical surveys, building surveys. And then we also have Delta Simons, who are multidisciplinary environmental consultancy and health and safety consultancies. And we do have waste expertise within Delta. And we also have, lastly, ground engineering, who do ground investigations and geotechnical investigations. But what's fun, too long, just a brief introduction as to who we are. So what I'll be talking to you about is regarding the UK and our existing health and safety and waste legislation, which steers us down the right route to encourage positive building hygiene. So as Ricky just said there regarding Denmark, we don't actually have legislation that directly says that we need to be recycling building materials, but we do have other legislation that encourages it and steers us down that route, because ultimately people will usually do whatever's the cheapest option, and if we make it cost prohibitive to do things badly, then people are more encouraged to do it the right way. Briefly, I'll just mention about the hierarchy of waste management options. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with that, but just in terms of hazardous waste and the thought process we need to follow in terms of what we'll be doing with our waste. Talking about separating hazardous materials from the rest of the inert materials, your brick and concrete. What happens if you don't? Because then it can get expensive. And then just briefly, a couple of examples, just a good and a bad example of bad practice in terms of when things have gone well and when things they haven't. So in the UK, with our legislation, we've kind of got two sides of things to talk about. We've got our health and safety side, and we've got our environmental side. So our primary legislation for health and safety is our Health and Safety at Work Act, which is relatively broad. Talks about employers providing safe places of work, for example. And beneath that, we have lots of regulations. So we have things like working at height regulations, confined space regulations, various health and safety. Specific ones for me to talk about are our control of asbestos regulations. over on the other side, in terms of environmental, we have our Environmental Protection Act, the Waste Framework Directive, and our Hazardous Waste Regulation. So we've got two sides. We've got health and safety and our environmental legislation, and both of these kind of come together to steer us into making sure building materials are safe and then can ultimately be reused. So just to say, the way our legislation works, we have our acts and regulations. Both of those are the law, so we need to abide by them. Our enforcement authorities are actually quite helpful. They write written documentation we call ACOPs, approved code of practice, and guidance documents that basically are in plainer English than legislation. It can be quite legal, difficult for some people to fully understand what they need to do and grasp. So our enforcement authorities have actually written some helpful guides and books for us to read to understand what we actually need to do to comply with the law. But ultimately, these acts and the regulations, they're the law, and that's what we're trying to comply with. So the main ones to talk about are the control of asbestos regulations. So they came out, well, revised, as they didn't just come out. We've had asbestos regulations since coming up nearly 100 years. It's getting on for that now. But the latest ones are 2012, so they came out just over 10 years ago. Now, within these regulations, there's around about 35 regulations. I'm not going to be obviously talking about them all. I'm just going to kind of try and keep this high level. But a couple of key ones, just to kind of give you an indication of how these regulations help us make sure building materials are safe. Our Regulation 5 says that as an employer, you are unable to undertake any demolition, maintenance, or anything else that may expose employees to asbestos unless you've done a suitable and sufficient assessment to find out if asbestos is present and the type and what sort of material it is in its condition, etc. Or the default position is you have to assume asbestos is present. So we could just assume that everything is asbestos, but that's going to make things quite difficult for us. So we need to do a suitable and sufficient assessment. Now, this doesn't actually say, for example, some of you may be in your own countries doing asbestos surveys. It doesn't state black and white, you must do an asbestos survey, but that's kind of where it's steering us down. But as part of that suitable and sufficient assessment, we ask ourselves a question in the UK, and that is, how old is the building? When was it constructed? Asbestos was finally outlawed. The last asbestos type was banned in 1999. So for us, any building which was constructed after the year 2000 can be considered asbestos free because it was illegal and prohibited to use asbestos from 1999. So from 2000, there should be no asbestos in there. However, if that building was constructed before the year 2000, there is a risk there could be asbestos in there. So we're going to need to do something else as part of this assessment. And that's where the asbestos survey comes in. So for a demolition of a building, we would do what we call a demolition asbestos survey, which is highly invasive. It involves us basically taking the building apart by hand, breaking apart false work, brickwork, lifting up floorboards, cutting holes in walls, trying to identify hidden asbestos that might not be immediately obvious. So our law says prior to demolition, we need to do an assessment to find out is asbestos there. And as we say, if it's pre-2000, we're going to do an investigation, a survey to therefore create what we call a register of known asbestos that we have within that building. So if we have asbestos and we identify asbestos, there is also a regulation, Regulation 16, that says we have a duty to prevent or reduce the spread of asbestos. So if you have asbestos within a building and you don't remove it and you just demolish that building, you will ultimately be spreading asbestos and in breach of this regulation. So we will be therefore breaking the law. So what the law here says, that basically we need to prevent or reduce the spread. So the easiest way to that is remove the asbestos prior to demolishing your building. If we remove the asbestos first, we're going to avoid spreading asbestos. That's in terms of very briefly on the control of asbestos regulations. I could talk about that all day, but obviously we've only got a short little window to talk about it here. In terms of environmental and waste regulations, for us here in the UK, we classify waste containing asbestos as hazardous waste if it has more than 0.1% asbestos within it. That 0.1%, however, relates to the asbestos within a piece of material. And if that piece of material, let's say a piece of asbestos cement, size of my thumb, which has about 10% asbestos content, was in the back of a lorry full of crushed brick and concrete, that entire load would be classified as hazardous waste because you're unable to dilute it down. So until that piece was removed, the whole load would be classified as hazardous waste. Just in terms of what we could do with waste, and it's particularly on hazardous waste, any waste, we should follow this hierarchy. And the number one thing we should be thinking about with waste is trying to avoid having any waste whatsoever. But if we're going to demolish a building, we're going to ultimately have some waste here. So we can't change what we're doing. We're going to have some waste. So we are going to have some waste. We need to do something with it. So if we can prepare it for reuse, so it says on here, checking and cleaning. So if we can clean it by removing the asbestos, then the remaining material may therefore be able to be reused. In terms of asbestos, we can't reuse asbestos in the UK. We can't recycle it or use it in any other way. Once it's reached the end of its life in a building, it's been removed, it has to be disposed of. Whilst there are some techniques to try and make it inert, pretty much 99.9% of all asbestos will ultimately end up being disposed of to hazardous waste landfill sites. So it is going to landfill, but with these asbestos materials, there isn't a great deal that we can do with them at the moment. So as we said, if we don't separate out the asbestos from the other material, it can start to cause problems because basically all of that material will be classified as hazardous waste. So on here you can see a couple of images of just general brick and concrete rubble, and mixed in here there are little fragments of asbestos cement and bits and pieces mixed in here. So this entire heap here, and probably what's all over this ground at the moment, is all classified as hazardous waste because all these bits of cement, as we say, well over 10% asbestos in even those pieces. You can't water it down with all the rest of it. So if they were to remove all this as one big load, the entire load would be classified as asbestos, as hazardous waste. Therefore, it's going to get expensive to deal with because we can't reuse it. We're ultimately going to have to dispose of it to a specialist landfill site, potentially. We could try, if we have got asbestos mixed in, to do a pick, separate it out. There are various techniques. Now, on a small scale, may be practicable. Large scale, it just may not be practical to do so. And that's where the entire load may end up going, or we may need to come up with a system to maybe somehow retain it on site. But either way, we're into quite a lot of money here, whereas if it had been removed first, it would have been easier. Once it's gone through a crusher, it's very hard to start trying to separate it. So just a couple of examples in case of where it went wrong and where it's some good practice. So the first one, we have a demolition project up in the northeast of England. So on this project, there was an in-ground obstruction, a concrete slab that the demolition contractor was breaking out and removing. They broke out this concrete slab, they crushed it, it was then spread around the site, and later down the line, somebody spotted some suspicious material on the ground, which was sampled, was identified as asbestos, and Lucien then did some more sampling regimes and determined that this was quite spread around the site. As part of the investigation process, it was basically assumed that this concrete that they'd broken out had asbestos shuttering within it, but it wasn't identified at the time. It was only identified after it had been broken out and crushed and then spread over the site. So because it means spread, all the inert aggregates were now classified potentially as hazardous materials. So to start removing all this, if we can't separate it out, we're into millions and millions of pounds. So Delta Simons were involved with coming up with a solution to try and avoid removing the material and retaining it on site, because you don't have to by default to start removing it all. We may be able to come up with a process to retain it. For example, keeping it on site and putting capping layers over the top, but that does involve a lot of liaison with our enforcement authorities, like our environment agencies and local authorities. So obviously it needs specialists to be able to come up with these ways of retaining it rather than spending all the money on disposing of it off site. So in terms of the investigation, why it had gone wrong, well, ultimately the contractor carrying out the work didn't have adequate supervision in terms of breaking out this concrete. The staff on sites actually had very limited knowledge of asbestos. It is a legal requirement in the UK under our asbestos regulations to provide information, instruction and training regards to asbestos if you were to potentially come across it as part of your working life in your job. So these people hadn't had the required level of training. They also had very limited knowledge in terms of our quality protocols regarding aggregates being made from inert material having no asbestos within them, and also very limited knowledge generally regarding environmental regulations. So quite a key bit of this was just education for their staff in terms of asbestos knowledge, because had those contractors doing the initial breaking out had that knowledge of what asbestos looks like, then they may be able to stop at that point before they went too far and then ultimately spread it all over the site. That was a case of where it went wrong. Very briefly on some good practice on how it should be done correctly. So we have a project up here in the northwest of England this time. So Lucien undertook a full demolition survey of this building. All asbestos which had been identified was then removed, and in this case it was removed by a licensed asbestos contractor. Again, that's another legal requirement in the UK. If you're working on high-risk asbestos materials that release a lot of asbestos fibres into the air, for example, spray coating, pipe laggings, fireproof boardings, insulation boards, those sort of things, then you need to hold a licence by the Enforcement Authority, the Health and Safety Executive, to work on those materials. And we also had some independent inspection carried out by Lucian. So separately from the asbestos contractor, we will do air tests and visual inspections and issue certification to verify that those areas are safe to reoccupy and to basically verify the completeness of the removal, that the asbestos had been removed. Therefore, demolition could proceed. In this case, all the demolition operatives involved had undertaken asbestos awareness training. One of the key reasons why people do need asbestos awareness training, because even after a demolition asbestos survey, there still remains a residual risk. There may be some asbestos in the building that might not have been identified yet. Some, breaking out some concrete, then it may be uncovered. That may not be something that's uncovered in the survey. So education and awareness is really, really important. The waste crushed material, the inert material, was tested for asbestos in accordance with its proposed use in terms of whether it was going to be reused for aggregate, etc. So we kind of got a bad practice there where we've done it wrong. We've not identified it first. We've then spread it around the site. Whereas actually, if we do things correctly, we identify them, we separate it out prior to disturbance. We can then actually separate out the clean material from the hazardous material, and therefore avoiding disposing all of it as hazardous material. So in terms of trying to promote some reuse, if we're making aggregate from inert crushed material, then we can't have asbestos in a product grade material. So we do already have quality protocols that state this. So if people have got crushed material, it's much cheaper to be able to use it for aggregates and dispose of it as hazardous waste. So actually, if they spend the money removing asbestos first, they're not spending all that money disposing of all that what would have been inert material as asbestos waste. We don't always have to get rid of things. We might be able to come up with a management plan in terms of keeping asbestos on sites. As we said before, could potentially come up with a capping system. But then we're into potential environmental permits, which can be difficult to obtain and bureaucratic and those sorts of things. It can be a slow process. Again, that's where you need your expertise from your consultants like we have at Delta to assist people with that. So that brings us to the end of my little section on the UK, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions once we get to the end, but I'll hand back to Heikki now. Thank you, Heikki.
Yep. Thank you, Chris. Very interesting presentation. So, but now we are moving on to Belgium, to our last presentation. Theo, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Wait, I'll share the presentation.
Yes.
Okay, good. So yeah, my name is Theo. I'm a senior advisor at Antea, Belgium, and yeah, I'd like to talk about the process of the traceability of wastes from demolition of buildings and other constructions in Flanders. I'll start off by telling that each year over 15 million tons of waste coming from demolition projects or renovation projects is produced, of which about 90% is stony materials, and about 95% of these materials are recycled due to material management. But how did the material management and the current recycling process came to be? Well, it started off in approximately 93 when the use of recycled granulates started. In 2005, a certification system was introduced, mainly for monitoring for asbestos. In 2008, a study showed that approximately 11% of the waste was non-compliant due to the presence of asbestos in the waste, which led to the introduction of EHR, which is a Flemish word, which stands for unity rulings. basically it comes down to that certain requirements on the quality of granulates were included in the Flemish regulations on the reuse of materials. And because of this, the basic quality of granulates improved vastly, and it gained more trust to reuse recycled granulates as opposed to always reaching for new primary granulates. A few years later, another study by OVAM, which is the Flemish Waste Authority, showed that 7% of the waste was still non-compliant due to asbestos. This led to a new approach by solving the problem at the source, which is done through the process of selective demolition. Prior to demolition, all materials will be identified and inventorized, and during demolition, there's a surveillance whether removal of waste happens in a correct manner. With the process of selective demolition, two new concepts were introduced in Flanders, the LMRP, which stands for Low Environmental Risk Stony Wastes, and HMRP, the High Environmental Risk Stony Wastes. The difference being the potential risk of the wastes on the environment. And of course, because the HMRP wastes have a higher potential risk, the processing cost at the crushing plant is much higher because it's more closely followed. And LMRP label can only be obtained when the contractor is working through the correct manner, which I will explain in a minute. To receive the said LMRP label, the waste coming from a demolition project should be accompanied by a processing permit. This permit contains information on the type of waste, and through that, the crushing plant can decide whether the waste can be accepted as LMRP or HMRP. To survey all of this, Trasimat was introduced in Flanders in the year 2014. Trasimat is essentially a demolition management organization, and its main task is to assure the quality of all the waste streams. They do that by surveying the SOP quality. I will get to the SOP in a minute. The correct removal of hazardous materials and the tracking of all materials. And through this procedure, they can guarantee higher quality input materials for crushing plants. This process has benefits for all of the stakeholders, mainly being lower costs due to lower risk materials. Unexpected costs can be avoided, and there's a lower impact on the environment. Here you can see a brief recap of the whole process of selective demolition. A part of this process takes place before the actual demolition, which is the part on the left side of the blue line. And the other part takes place during or after the demolition works. The different colors in this scheme represents the different parties which are doing all the works. So first we'll take a look at the before demolition part. In the beginning, a SOP is made by an expert. A SOP is the expert being a neutral party, independent of the contractor. Most of the time, it's a consultancy agency. But what is a SOP? It's a kind of a report which contains an inventory of all materials that are expected to be released during the demolition of a building or a structure. But also included are recommendations for selective demolitions. And the expert needs to follow the standard procedures for making the SOP. First, the inventory of all the materials is a list of all types of materials that are expected. So this means all types of materials, not just the hazardous ones, but also non-hazardous, from the substructures to the superstructures, and also the infrastructure. The guidelines described in the standard procedure made by Tracimat should be followed. This contains a preliminary historic investigation, but also a field investigation with visual inspection of the structures, measuring of all the different materials, and the sampling of potentially hazardous materials. The recommendations that are made in the SOP can be very general, but can also be quite site-specific. Some examples are the mandatory separation of different fractions of waste, but can also be removal techniques for asbestos or other hazardous materials, and certain recycling possibilities. As I said earlier, the SOP is made prior to demolition works and should be done as complete as possible. Any limitations on the investigation, closed rooms, or for example, should always be reported and explained. When the SOP is finished, it's submitted with Tracimat. They check the conformity of the SOP with the standard procedures. And when they agree with the information, you get a conformity certificate from Tracimat, and the demolition works may begin. Then the start of the demolition begins, and the contractor has to make sure that prior to the non-hazardous materials, all the asbestos and other potentially dangerous materials should be removed first and in a correct manner. When that is done, the expert is again notified, and an audit is executed. The expert then makes an audit report where the process is described. Again, this report is submitted with Tracimat. They check the conformity of the report and whether the contractor followed the rules. And if so, then a new conformity certificate is delivered. With this new conformity certificate, the contractor can apply for the earlier mentioned processing permit. Then the waste accompanied by the processing permit is then sent off to the crushing plant. The crushing plant can then decide whether it can be accepted as a low environmental risk stony waste or not. And in the end of the whole process, the contractor receives a demolition certificate with all the information of the materials and the amounts, which he can then show to the owner of the building that the process has been followed and everything was done in a correct fashion. Then I will give a brief example of some of the forms from a SOP. This is a small case in which we made a SOP for an office building in the city center of Antwerp, which contained a few shops also. Here you can see an example. The form on the left side of the screen is an extract from a photo report in which every space in the building and every different type of material is photographed and included in the report. And on the right side is a form, an example of a form from a potentially hazardous material with all the information that we have on that moment. So whether there's damage through the material, what do we expect it to be, was there a sample taken or not, and so on. And this is an example of an inventory with a listing of all different materials and the location in the construction. And every type of material gets a certain code, and an estimation is also made of the quantities of the different materials. So yeah, thank you. That was all for my presentation. If there are any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you, Theo, for a very good presentation. But sorry, guys, our time is up. So thanks a lot for nice presentations and also good questions and also good answers from experts. So it's a very interesting topic and remains hot. So that at least I think that maybe it should be repeated, and we can think about other angles also when it comes to the circularity of building materials. So so thanks a lot, and we will send you all participants also recordings and also presentations will be made available for you. So thanks a lot and see you next time. Stay tuned to the Inogen webinars. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.